So friends, let's start, and let me welcome you all for this afternoon's seminar on Narendra Modi's religious diplomacy and the reinvention of Indian foreign policy. The title is quite self-evident, but the subject matter, I think there's been huge debates on Modi's foreign policy, but very little discussion on the religious dimension of it. I think that Modi seems to have introduced, while many countries religion and culture play a very important part in foreign policy. The Indian case, I think generally, at least the theory is that India keeps them separate. We've seen some of those lines blur under Modi. Like you see already a picture out there. When Modi first went to Japan, he spent time praying in a Buddhist temple. And we also saw him in the first visit to go to Nepal, to the Pashupatinath temple where he prayed. So India is quite familiar with all the neighboring country leaders who come to Delhi, go to Ajmer. For example, the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis pray at the Ajmer Dargah. We know the Sri Lankan leaders who come and go to see Sai Baba or someone else, or Tirupati temple where, for example, Rajapaksa, just before losing the election, he went to Tirupati to pray to Lord Venkateshwara. I think, so leaders too have their beliefs, but I think in India it's been a sense of separation between the two, which has changed, I think, both in terms of how Modi has used the religious metaphor, used the religious dimension to strengthen ties, for example, with the Buddhist world, or his outreach to even to the Muslim world. So I think it's a very interesting feature. And to talk about it, we have Professor Ian Hall. He's Professor of International Relations at Griffith University. He's also associated with the Australia-India Institute. He's also with the Griffith Asia Institute. I, for one, really believe that Ian has been writing, with great sensitivity about India's foreign policy and developments in India, so it's a special privilege to welcome here this afternoon. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be back here. It's a pleasure also to see you again. I've actually been in Singapore now for 6 weeks or so as at RSIS, and everybody has been enormously hospitable and kind during my stay. So I'd just like to thank everyone for that. This is, of course, also Singapore being a wonderful place for which to watch India. It's a place in which obviously there is a substantial diaspora, some who've moved here a long time ago for various different reasons, and some much more recently. And so it is a wonderful kind of vantage point from which to observe at a distance, but not too great a distance. I was going to start off with an anecdote. That's kind of tends to be a helpful thing to do, I think. Okay. And the anecdote sort of begins in March of 2016. And that's when this occurs. So Narendra Modi already, by that point, had been Indian Prime Minister for almost two years or so, and he goes along to participate in this major event that's happening in Delhi. It's called the World Culture Festival, and it was organised by Ravi Shankar's Art of Living Foundation. Now, supposedly, about 3.5 million people attended this, according to Art of Living. I can't independently verify the numbers. A very large number are also supposed to have watched this event on television or through the internet or various other kinds of media as well. This took place on the floodplain of the Yamuna, just outside Delhi. And the government itself actually helped to support the event. So not only did Modi go along to go and speak and open the event, the government also put money into it. 2.25 crore rupees were put in from the government to support the staging of the event. According again to the Art of Living Foundation, about 1,000 religious leaders took part in this event. 750 key politicians also attended the event. And these included a whole number of international participants. So people like Dominique de Villepin, the former French Prime Minister, attended. Former President Obasanjo of Nigeria attended. The Grand Mufti of Syria attended the event, and a whole number of other luminaries and interesting characters went along. So too did most of Modi's major ministers. So the others that addressed the event, apart from the Prime Minister himself, Arun Jaitley, Swaraj, Rajnath Singh, and Amit Shah himself played a major role towards the end of the event. So the question is, why was there such substantial government involvement in this major civil society event? Why were they paying for it? Why were they participating in it? Why were they playing such a major role? And the argument for this, or the explanation for this, actually came in Modi's very brief remarks with which he opened this. And here you can see him opening the event. Art of Living, Modi argued, is promoting India's soft power. It's promoting intercultural and interreligious, interfaith dialogue. It's promoting the idea that India is a sort of soft power, superpower, if you like, that under the world is one family. It's an incredibly important notion. So here you have a Prime Minister that is actively supporting the civil society event, but arguing that this has some kind of international effect beyond the borders of India. So it has some sort of quasi-diplomatic or para-diplomatic kind of effect. What I'm interested in then in this paper, but also in the book that I'm writing, is why is it that the government is sponsoring these kinds of activities, engaging in them so heavily, and try and explain what's going on. My argument in the book and in the paper is to say that this investment in these kinds of activities signals a quite genuine conviction. It's not just a cynical kind of act, it's a genuine conviction, at least on the part of some within the BJP and in the wider Hindu nationalist environment, that India has some bigger kind of civilizational or cultural role to play, and that India's soft power is a big potential asset in international relations that can serve its wider foreign policy interests. So it's, to use the language of Ram Madhav, who's one of Modi's lieutenants within the BJP, a key lieutenant, in fact, that Sanskriti, or as he wants to translate it, culture is a source of Indian power, that Samvad or dialogue is one of the means by which this power can be exercised in international relations, and that through this exercise of soft power and through this focus on Sanskriti, what he wants to understand as culture, that this is going to, in some sense, restore not just the power or influence of India, but also the pride of ordinary Indians and the pride of India itself in its own cultural assets and in its place in the world. So you might have seen this back in 2015 at a major meeting that the BJP have. In order to try and explain what Modi's approach to foreign policy is, Ram Madhav comes up with this notion of the Panch Amrit, obviously from devotional practice. He takes this idea of the Panch Amrit and he uses it to try to set out this Modi doctrine of kinds. It's not actually the first time that the Panch Amrit gets used in this way. Modi uses it previously in another incarnation while he's Chief Minister of Gujarat to describe different development agenda, but it's an interesting kind of appropriation that Madhav uses. Modi doesn't actually himself pick up on this. He doesn't talk, he uses some of the words, some of the aspects of Madhav's formulation of his Modi doctrine in later speeches, but he doesn't pick up on it wholesale. The closest that he comes to it, to using these expressions and talking about a Panch Amrit, he doesn't talk about it using that word, but talking about these various concepts, is in his Shangri-La speech, which was given here in early June of 2018. So by focusing on Sanskriti and Samvad, India can then establish itself as a Vishwaguru, and a world guru. That's a crucial idea. And this is an idea which you find running all the way through Modi's thinking about international relations, but also importantly through the RSS's thinking about international relations. It's an idea which crops up repeatedly in RSS conversations about what India's role ought to be in international politics. Now, I don't think that this is kind of epiphenomenal. I don't think that it's unimportant. I actually think it's central to the agenda that Modi's government has tried to prosecute. So that Modi's government has made religious diplomacy crucial and central to its international outreach. and it's part and parcel an expression of a different way of viewing India's role in the world, and in fact a different way of viewing international relations, as a way that thinking about diplomacy not as a state-to-state exercise, but actually as a society-to-society exercise, as something that's driven between cultures and civilizations and societies, not just states. And I might add to this, that fits with another oddity or another interesting aspect of Hindu nationalist political thinking, which is their ambivalence about the state. So whilst the RSS and other Hindu nationalists might talk about establishing a Hindu Rashtra, they actually are quite ambivalent about the concept of the state. Ideally, politics should simply flow from society, and you shouldn't need to have major, overweening, well-developed political structures and institutions in order to run a society. It ought to just kind of happen almost naturally. And I don't want to get into that, but I can do in questions if you like. So what has Modi then been doing? Well, he's been travelling around the place, but he's been practicing religious diplomacy or public diplomacy in a rather different way to what previous governments have done. India is an interesting case because it's long invested in certain varieties of what we might call public diplomacy, that is, the state speaking to foreign publics. So Nehru in particular invested quite heavily in public diplomacy as a means of trying to get to achieve India's foreign policy interests or pursue their interests by engaging with foreign publics, by swaying foreign public opinion, and thereby changing the attitude of states and others towards India. So, as we all know, he holds the Asian Relations Conference. He also is helpful, supportive of things like the ICCR. The All India Radio has an external service in which it broadcasts in multiple South Asian languages, and part of that is a kind of soft power push within the region, and that's been going on for a very long period of time. Later governments, particularly Vajpayee's government and Singh's government, stepped up this engagement in public diplomacy. A lot of this was about branding India, it was about PR, it was about particularly attracting foreign businesses and tourists and so on. And so we all know about the Incredible India campaign, which is said to be one of the great nation branding campaigns of the 1990s, India Everywhere and so on and so forth. So all these things have been done before. And of course the last government, UPA 1 government, created a specific public diplomacy division within the MEA to push some of these and other initiatives in international politics. Towards the end of UPA 2, however, the public diplomacy division was actually got rid of. Interestingly, Modi's government didn't bring it back. It was merged into the external publicity division of the MEA, and it hasn't been demerged. There hasn't been, in fact, substantial investment in the MEA's public diplomacy apparatus. And that tells you something, too, quite important about, again, the relationship between the Hindu nationalists and the state. They're not investing in state mechanisms for public diplomacy. Instead, they want to use other kinds of channels. Last but not least, the public diplomacy that all these governments have engaged in, including Modi's, has been as much aimed at the diaspora as it's been aimed at others, non-Indians or non-Indians, persons of Indian origin. Diaspora engagement's been absolutely critical to the last three governments, and it is just as critical to the Modi government. It's just being done in a different kind of way. All right, so what has Modi then been doing? Well, interestingly, as I say, he hasn't invested heavily in the apparatus of the state. So we haven't seen huge amounts of money flowing into the Ministry of External Affairs to try and promote a public diplomacy agenda. In fact, if you look at the budgets, you'll see that the budget numbers for the public diplomacy division have actually declined over Modi's period in government. So he's interested in soft power public diplomacy, but not through the MEA. That's an important thing. Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs was, of course, immediately, once the NDA government gets in, put under Swaraj, and so she ran both ministries at the same time, and then in early 2016 they were merged together. And again, this tells you something about the kind of attitude that the Modi government has about public diplomacy and diaspora engagement. It's running all of these things together, focusing the MEA increasingly on consular affairs and diaspora engagement rather than on the kind of like high policy areas. They've even discussed the idea of shutting the external service of All India Radio, as well as shutting down those foreign language broadcasts. So they've got this clear emphasis on soft power, and yet they're not investing in the normal institutional means in order to do this. Where they are investing are in things like the so-called Acharya envoys. So they've sent out 3 yoga and Sanskrit experts to the United States to put them in missions in Washington, Chicago, and I forget where else, maybe Miami or somewhere, in order to teach yoga and to teach Indian cultural ideas to Americans and to the diaspora and so on. And on the right-hand side there, you can see the picture of the Indian embassy staff, the effects of these Acharya envoys in action. They've trained the embassy staff to do their yoga poses. So instead, what's the strategy? Well, the strategy is quite interesting. It's very much Modi-centric, as many things are in this particular government. It's very much pushing forward Modi, as Amit Shah says, as the torchbearer of the nation's pride globally, pushing the idea that the world is one family, that's found in the Vedas, pushing Vivekananda particularly, or Aurobindo to some degree or another, pushing the Vedas and pushing yoga and so on. They also at the same time using non-state bodies, so not the MEA, but instead using the party, the BJP, the RSS, the HSS in particular in the United States, and other bodies like the VHP out there in the rest of the world to try and coordinate second-track dialogues and have conversations with civil society groups beyond the kind of conventional state-to-state diplomatic action that we see. The BJP itself has actually been conducting a fair amount of quasi-diplomatic activity with other parties as well. And they're trying to activate the diaspora in order to use them as an exemplar to others of India's cultural values and civilizational power and so on, these kinds of ideas. They're trying to organise, to coalesce the diaspora and to try and use that as a kind of quasi-diplomatic tool. The most kind of obvious manifestations of this are Modi's very regular and frequent visits to religious sites. These visits take a number of different forms. So he's visited a number of Hindu temples, particularly in Nepal and Sri Lanka, and beyond South Asia, also where there are sizable diaspora groups. So, for example, temple in Singapore, on one of his visits to Singapore. And then occasionally also to Sikh Gurdwaras in Vancouver, notably, and I think there's one other occasion, that slips my memory. Perhaps more significantly have been Modi's multiple visits to Buddhist sites. These include sites in China, Japan, Mongolia, Myanmar, and Vietnam, a number of different places, fairly consistently during his period in office. And here he's emphasising constantly in remarks that he makes that the past cultural, civilizational, intellectual, religious ties that India has with the rest of Asia. And of course emphasising that these ties were not coercive, that these ideas were not forced upon anybody, that they simply spread because of their innate attraction and appeal to others, and so on. Interestingly too, the Modi government or the BJP, and to some extent the RSS, the linked think tanks with them, have also organised a series of other kinds of interfaith dialogue events and other things. If we look, for example, at there's a global Hindu-Buddhist Samvad that has been organised between the Japanese and the Vivekananda International Foundation. And that's been run now twice, once in Delhi, once in Myanmar. The Myanmar government or Myanmar agencies were brought into that for the second thing. The India Foundation runs a Dhamma conference, again a Hindu-Buddhist dialogue process, and has been doing that annually since the end of 2014. So there'll be multiple Hindu-Buddhist engagements. These run counter to some attitudes within the Hindu nationalist movement. If we look back at people like Gowalkar and others, they argued that Buddhism was not a positive influence on India, that they had made, that the eruption of Buddhism in Indian history had made Indians weak and exposed them to outside invasion and so on. And Gowalkar and others had denounced the sort of recrudescence, the re-emergence of Buddhist ideas in the 20th century, through work of people like Gandhi and others, as producing what he called imbecilic political positions, such as pacifism and other things like that. So this is an interesting development in terms of the kind of internal politics and ideology of Hindu nationalism as well. So we've got temples, some of them in the region, but we've also got this Buddhist engagement as well, and then we have multiple dialogues going on too. Interestingly as well, Modi has visited a number of mosques, again in significant locations, in Abu Dhabi, in Oman, in Jakarta very recently as well. And he visited a mosque in Ahmedabad with Shinzo Abe in, I can't remember exactly, 2016 I think. Yeah. These visits of course have been carefully choreographed and sold. They're quite, I mean, this first one is very light-hearted. You can see here he is, here's Modi taking his selfie in front of the mosque in Abu Dhabi to try and disarm potential critics of him possibly trying to appease Muslims in some sense or another. They've also been carefully timed, usually before elections in which there's a sizable Muslim vote that either the BJP wants to neutralise or wants to, in some sense, win over as well. These visits are targeted very much at the Muslim diaspora, particularly in the Middle East. And here it's trying to extend this broader idea that this government and others, but this government particularly, have promoted, that India is a protector of its diaspora. Of all people of Indian origin should look to New Delhi as a protector of their interests, a protector of their persons and so on. Hence the emphasis on the consular engagement by the MEA. Hence the constant engagement of the External Affairs Minister on Twitter with people who've lost their passports and so on and so forth, often ridiculed and laughed at, but actually something which gets extremely good press in much of the media within India. And then Modi's been actively promoting various ideas, yoga being the most obvious of these. The idea that the Vedas might provide some kind of guidance on climate change, for example, has cropped up in a number of his speeches, echoing comments that he made in a book back in 2012 on climate change. Now, so why do any of this? You could have just stuck to the established approach, which also made a lot of India's great cultural inheritance and its civilizational inheritance. So if you look back at what was done under Vajpayee, Singh and so on, if you look back at what was done under Nehru, none of these things were neglected, these kind of cultural links across Asia. It's simply that under Modi they're being practiced in a different way and with a different kind of level of intensity. So what's going on? Well, I'm arguing in the book that Modi has tried to reinvent foreign policy. And what do I mean by that? So if we go back to John Harris and Stuart Corbridge, who wrote a book, a couple of decades ago now, I think, they argued that modern India was an invention, a very common idea. Modern India is an invention of Nehru Patel, the others, the Congress generation, post-colonial generation. They sought to build out of, not quite nothing, but out of de novo, a modern socialist, secular, democratic society. And they did so in very difficult, problematic circumstances, but this was their active invention. Corbridge and Harris argue that since then there have been two attempts, they think linked, at reinvention. One of them was the upsurge of Hindu nationalism, of Hindutva ideas that challenged the secular and socialist and to some extent modern character of this invented state. And then the second attempt at reinvention has been what they call the upsurge of neoliberalism. I don't like that term for a variety of different reasons, but the upsurge of neoliberalism, which has tried to replace the socialist-controlled planned state via market reforms and liberalisation. Now, both of these have had their effect on the Indian state, and we all know all about that as well. But neither of them affected foreign policy in a very substantial way, is my argument. And I'm open to challenge on this. If we look back, we see substantial changes in Indian foreign policy, but not the emergence of a radically new way of grounding it and explaining it, not a new ideology of Indian foreign policy. Instead, we see a shift to a more pragmatic, incrementalist, sometimes I don't know what's the word that I'm looking for. Well, anyway, we see a much more pragmatic approach emerging, and we see that under Narasimha Rao, then we see it under Vajpayee, we see it under Singh to some extent. And what passes for an ideology of foreign policy is this idea of strategic autonomy, which emerges towards the end of the Vajpayee era, and then particularly in the Singh period. But this really is just an updated version of non-alignment, stripped of much of its ideological foundations, this idea of strategic autonomy. And there remains within the elite broad affection for Nehruvian conceptions of international politics, for Nehru's legacy, rightly, which is a fairly impressive legacy. There remains a broad affection for this idea of non-alignment. And we see that when we look at that famous 2012 document that comes out of the Centre for Policy Research, Non-Alignment 2.0. The choice of the title, controversial though it was, indicates to some degree the level of establishment and admiration for this concept. So what is this reinvention that Modi wants to engage in involve? Firstly, it involves dropping the language of Nehru and Nehruvianism almost wholesale. There's an odd inclusion of the expression strategic autonomy in the Shangri-La speech in June. I'm not quite sure how it got there, and I'd be open to any information on exactly why it emerges into that speech. But otherwise, ideas like non-alignment, strategic autonomy, and so on are written out of Modi's foreign policy. The Nehruvian concerns are gone. And the fact that he doesn't attend NAM summits and so on and so forth are important. Second thing is trying to seek to frame foreign policy in Hindu nationalist language and to conduct it in line with ideology. So Ram Madhav's Panch Amrit is one way of doing this, picked up early on in part by Modi, or picked up in part by Modi, but not in a consistent way. In fact, it's hard to work to kind of pass the speeches in order to come up with a consistent ideology all the way through. But Modi's religious diplomacy is not an add-on to this, it's actually central to this broader effort to reinvent foreign policy. The visits to religious sites, the sponsorship of the Acharya envoys, for example, so-called, the use of interfaith dialogues, so on and so forth, the use of parallel track 2 in think tank and party level engagement with other groups. All of this is important, and it's all explainable in terms of belief. In terms of trying to realise the long-standing Hindu nationalist idea that India is destined to be a Vishwaguru. That India's ideas are going to transform the world, they're going to solve the problems that the world has in terms of its relationship with people's relationship with the environment, for example. It's going to solve conflict, and particularly interreligious and ideological conflict. So this means sweeping away secularism in foreign policy, as well as the old invention involved sweeping away secularism domestically. So why do it? I think there are two explanations, one ideological and one in terms of electoral politics. The first one is there's a genuine belief in these ideas. They actually believe that these are the right things to be doing for India, that India will prosper if the object is to realise this destiny as Vishwaguru. There's a real conviction that India will emerge as such if it practices and behaves in this way, especially within the RSS, but I think also in significant elements of the BJP. And this chimes with, to some degree, a kind of softer nationalist conviction that India still has much to teach the world, and that India's pride, there's an element of pride that still needs to be restored. So that fully restoring pride, influencing and so on, these are important objectives. The second thing is electoral politics, and playing on this belief among voters that there is still work to be done to restore India's pride in the world, or India's standing, honour, pride, and so on. This is a crucial point. We all know, as political scientists, that foreign policy doesn't win elections. Okay, it's one of those rules that we hear and we drum into our students. Foreign policy doesn't win elections. People vote on healthcare, they vote on jobs, they vote on education, they vote on all those sorts of things. But foreign policy does matter in terms of the perceptions of leaders. Kanti Vajpayee argues, in a really very interesting essay that he published a few years ago, that Vajpayee's decision to test the nuclear weapons in 1998 shifted views of his leadership, and that one of the factors that influenced his decision-making was this question of the way in which he was perceived by voters. He was perceived, I think, I'm attending at lunchtime, he says he was sort of in a grandfatherly way to some degree. You know, he was to some extent a poet and intellectual. He was perceived as being a moderate and so on. But some in the electorate saw him as being, as Kanti says in his essay, weak and rather ineffectual. And in order to address this, Vajpayee had to do something, and something early that was dramatic, in order to create a different impression of his leadership. And Kanti's argument is that what happens is that after the nuclear test, Vajpayee is seen as a different kind of leader, as being decisive, as being rational, as being measured as well, and as being strong and successful. Despite all the problems that the nuclear test might have brought about, Vajpayee's personal reputation is changed, and we see mettle in him in the way that we perhaps didn't see before. Now, I'm not arguing in any sense, nor does Kanti argue in any sense, that this shapes a particular electoral outcome, but rather it shapes the perception of the leadership. The other effect that it has, Kanti argues, is that it depoliticizes foreign policy. It removes foreign policy as an area of party political contestation, at least for a period of time. It helps to explain why Vajpayee's government doesn't face the same kind of criticism about foreign policy issues in the aftermath of the nuclear tests that other governments had faced in the past. So we don't see an upsurge of criticism over India's or the management of Kargil, for example, that becomes so damaging that the government loses office, or the hijacking of IC-814, or the terrorist incident in 2001-2002. Kanti wants to argue, I should say my interpretation of Kanti's argument is, that the level of criticism is lower as a consequence of this new perception of Vajpayee's leadership. In Modi's case, of course, we've got a different kind of character. Modi's already perceived as a strong man. So what does he need to be perceived as? Well, a statesman, and a kind of a much more inclusive kind of leader, a leader who, in fact, is more in touch with all of those cultural things to which Vajpayee didn't need to strive to demonstrate that he was culturally engaged, interested in ideas, and so on and so forth. He already had an established reputation for this. Modi, on the other hand, doesn't perhaps have this. So he needs to acquire a different kind of reputation as a statesman on a world stage. Now, others explain these things in terms of personal ego and so on. I think that's part of it, but I don't want to go there for this particular moment. Then the perception is then that something like religious diplomacy is a core component of achieving this objective, of restoring confidence to Indians about their place in the world, as his economic diplomacy is about restoring confidence in India's economy amongst NRIs and PIOs and so on, as well as amongst foreigners. And again, a bit like the economic diplomacy, it's partly about foreign opinion, but it's largely actually about domestic opinion, and I mean domestic opinion as the Hindu nationalists perceive it, that is including the diaspora as well. Domestically, I think we can probably say this behaviour has paid off. So despite most academic analysts arguing that few major substantive things have changed under Modi in terms of foreign policy, and I've published on this and a number of others have as well, few things have really changed. The broad direction of foreign policy is quite similar to what we've seen in the past. We can talk about that in questions if you like. In terms of the substance, the presentation of foreign policy has obviously changed. Whether Modi's foreign policy has been successful or not is an open question. Some argue that on Pakistan and China in particular, India maybe is in a weaker position than it was prior to 2014. There's been less success than we might have seen. And yet, we don't see as much criticism of foreign policy domestically as arguably we might. Is this then, I want to ask, a kind of function of this depoliticization that Kanti talks about in his essay? Is there no criticism because Modi is already regarded as being this statesman-like figure directing foreign policy, and so there's less criticism of his conduct? If we look at the polls, there's some evidence for that. So in 2016, there was a poll taken then, a big national poll, that showed that, broadly speaking, most of the electorate was satisfied with the direction of India's foreign policy at that time. There was an even more dramatic poll that the Times of India ran in May of 2018, in which apparently 67% of those asked rated Modi's foreign policy as very good, and 80% as good and very good. Only about 16% thought that it was not doing very well. So Modi rides extremely high in foreign policy issues in a way that he doesn't in other areas. And again, I want to say that this might have something to do with these attempts to try and make this a Modi-centric and a more cultural, religious kind of process. So the difficulty, though, within all this public diplomacy, with religious diplomacy more broadly, is that there's always going to be a gap between rhetoric and reality, and that others will point this out. So let me give you one example, and I'll go back to this one example that I began at the beginning, the World Cultural Festival that was held by Art of Living on the Yamuna floodplain in 2016. Once the event had ended, it had become clear that this event, which was partly about promoting environmental sustainability and about promoting kind of Indian wisdom about living with the environment in a kind of more sustainable fashion, that this event had badly damaged the Yamuna floodplain, putting 3.5 million people and running all the events and so on and so forth had really damaged the floodplain itself and its flora and fauna. 170 hectares had been damaged by the event. So said the National Green Tribunal. It was going to cost 13 crore rupees to repair the damage, and even then there was said to be irreparable damage to some of the flora and fauna in that particular area. The National Green Tribunal proposed that the Art of Living Foundation be fined 5 crore rupees in order to sort of help with this process of rejuvenation. And of course, Art of Living refused to pay. They challenged the report, they wrapped it up in the courts, they've sued the person who was responsible for the original report on the environmental damage, and as yet this incident has not, in fact, been resolved. So the difficulty with these messages that Modi is putting out in terms of religious diplomacy, in terms of intercultural, interfaith, interreligious dialogue, and so on and so forth, the difficulties with the appeals to the Vedas and to Vivekananda in particular, the arguments that India or Hinduism intrinsically is much more, it's not tolerant because it goes further than tolerance in accepting other ideas and so on and so forth. The idea that there are multiple paths to God and so on are undercut by a whole number of things that actually happen within India. Now, the obvious thing that's pointed out quite frequently here is communal violence. That communal violence undercuts this message. That attacks on Muslim butchers, for example, is one of the things that undercuts this broader message of religious unity and diversity, and so on and so forth that wants to be put forward. But let me put out one other example, and I'm not pushing a barrow here as somebody who is in fact agnostic and therefore struggles when he fills in his visa applications to go to India, where there's no box to tick for agnostic. You have to express a view about which religion you are. Sometimes I just change my position and decide to be a Buddhist this week, and so on. But anyway, so I'm not pushing a barrow on this particular sort of thing. Modi's been very interested in temples, very interested in Sikh temples, in Hindu temples, Buddhist sites, and so on and so forth. He's never once visited a Christian church. Not once during all of this time. And he's been highly resistant about a papal visit, something that Francis has been extremely interested in doing. There are limits, in other words, to this kind of commitment to intercultural, interreligious, interfaith dialogue. There are limits to this religious diplomacy, and that limit itself reveals something quite interesting. This hostility to Christianity is intrinsic to RSS ideology. And so what I want to suggest then is that this is a function of Hindu nationalist ideology being expressed through national diplomacy. And I think I'll leave there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I think that lays out a lot to discuss, both the dynamics of Indian foreign policy under Modi as well as the religious dimension. So we have quite a bit of time, so I think we can have a fairly good and substantive discussion. Who wants to start off? Ron, yeah.
You talk about Modi's interest in soft power, but not wanting to channel it through MEA. But there was talk earlier in the year of the MEA coming up with a matrix of soft power and with a game plan how to sort of take these next steps of whatever matrix they would come up with. The fact that this was it was MEA that was tasked with this, to me indicates that he's not entirely gone away from the idea that they would be involved in that. So I'd just be curious about your thoughts there.
Go ahead.
Oh, you're right. I mean, you're right. That's something which I need to take into consideration on that. This question. I remember that vaguely. Like that's something which I need to integrate into this. I guess. I mean, the other thing is that if we look at what's being produced by the public diplomacy people, well, now the external publicity division, what we can see is that there is a significant shift. So whereas prior to 2011, there was some focus on cultural and religious questions in the kind of things that they produced, which are predominantly kind of YouTube videos, ebooks, and so on, and some of the talks that they have promoted and so on. After 2014, we see a clear shift towards much more kind of culturally focused, religiously focused kinds of materials, as well as a very significant shift towards producing things that are very much focused on Modi himself. So there's a whole series of ebooks that get produced from late 2014 onwards that gather up Modi's speeches, but also include a whole bunch of data and statistics and arguments and so on and so forth about particular bilateral relationships and so on. And they're all branded, they all have special branding, they're all quite glossy and so on. So we do see a shift in the way that they use the MEA. I think that's right. The resourcing question, I think, is an interesting one. So there are 9 offices within that external publicity division that does, both public diplomacy and the external publicity things. And that's up slightly in the last 6 months from 7. So there has been a little bit of a resourcing change, but when I looked at the budgets haven't gone up. In fact, the budgets have gone down slightly. But I agree with you that tasking the MEA to perform that act might sort of slightly undercut one of the legs of my argument. But I'd still stick to the overall view that there's been a clear kind of shifting of the MEA towards the more consular side. So it's not just a question of saying that the MEA has been stripped of some of its responsibility to come up with policy, that these things are now being done within the PMO, which is a kind of standard narrative and critique of Modi's approach to foreign policy. It's also that some of the other tasks that the MEA was engaged in the past have been shifted slightly, or their focus has been shifted, which we would expect, but it's interesting nevertheless. And instead, what we've got is an MEA that's much more focused on diaspora protection and consular issues and so on and so forth.
So, yes, please. Yeah, just introduce yourself.
I'm Aarti Mehra. I'm a banker. Professor Hall, thank you for pointing out the 2 drivers that you think sort of underpin this Modi's foreign policy and use of religious symbols. And you've said it's mainly ideological and electoral. Those are the 2 considerations. But if you were to look at the major world powers today, wouldn't you say that perhaps the reason for this shift is a response to what is actually being peddled by the major powers? So China, for instance, projects itself very much as a civilizational power. How would you contrast Modi's narrative with that? And in fact, even the US under Obama had a certain ideological and civilizational almost narrative to it, and a different one under Trump. So could it not be that is what is shaping Modi's narrative? And a second very sort of specific question is, what do you read as the reception to this changed narrative by Modi in the US, in Japan and China?
Thank you very much. Those are really interesting questions. Let me start with the second one first, in that classic academic style. I think the reception's clearly kind of mixed, and I don't think it's. If we look in the aggregate, so all these soft power initiatives are really difficult to measure. People do polling, various organisations do polling, and they do surveys in order to try and find out about foreign public opinion and foreign perceptions. If we look at foreign perceptions of India, they haven't shifted really very much in a decade. So when they ask, so Pew, for example, asked questions about how do we expect, do we expect India to act responsibly or lead in the world? They frame it in a particular kind of way. What we find is that the answers don't really change a whole lot. There's a little bit of a jump post-2014, but not particularly. If we look, the impact on China is very difficult to judge, very difficult indeed. So let me set that one to the side for the moment. If we look at Japan, though, I think there the kind of the drawing of these broader cultural connections and so on. This has a very specific kind of influence in Japan. For more than a decade or so, the object has been to try and boost religious tourism, for example, and to create a Buddhist circuit for tourists. And there is clear evidence that says that Japanese tourists, in particular Japanese Buddhist tourists, are interested in going and engaging in India and doing these kinds of things. But in terms of measuring the political effect, it's extremely difficult to do. The second question is about So, of course, every country thinks it's exceptional and it has its own particular ideology that it thinks is better than all the others, and that's clearly the case. The narrative of a civilizational power, which has been developed by some Chinese nationalists, interestingly has been picked up by some Hindu nationalists. So they use the phrase civilizational power occasionally. Taran Vijay, for example, is one good example of this. He knows about this Chinese nationalist kind of narrative about civilizational power and wants to use it as well, wants to adopt it and so on. And there are some references to civilizational power that you can find in some kind of RSS-aligned kind of speeches and statements and so on and so forth. So it's a concept that's been borrowed. It has a very specific kind of meaning, though. Like in the Chinese context, it has a very specific meaning. So a civilizational power is one that is monocultural to some degree, or that has one overarching set of ideas or cultural practices that you can appeal to. And it's opposed to, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, what some Chinese nationalists will call mongrel states, and that's the United States. So the United States, because it's a multicultural society, because it is a secular multicultural society, they argue is inherently divisible and fragmented, and therefore doesn't have the same kind of power and influence, or won't have the same kind of power and influence ultimately as China will have. So those Hindu nationalists that are sceptical about the United States, of which there are many, of course, and see the United States as a significant cultural challenge, even though they also will argue sometimes that the United States is this kind of mongrel, fragmented kind of state. And if they don't have that unity, which comes, that unity in diversity, as they would say, that India has or that China has, that will make it weaker in international affairs. So it has had a bit of an effect in there as well. And in that sense, this framing of India as a cultural power or as a civilizational power is partly a response to these other narratives that are going on out there in the world. And I think just to finish off, I think we are getting to the point where there is an ideological kind of contest or dimension coming back into international politics. And that's going to be very interesting to watch. Thanks. Do you want to?
Thank you very much for the talk. At the beginning of your talk, you used the word doctrine a few times, the Modi doctrine. So I wasn't quite sure if that was your own words or you're quoting someone else. So, but then my question would be, what definition of doctrine are you using, either to describe or to analyze whether this in fact adds up to something more than the sum of its parts?
So fortunately, in 2015, I published a really short piece saying there isn't one. There is no Modi doctrine. No, that's all right. And it was in response to a whole bunch of claims that said that there was this kind of definite doctrine that was emerging. The whole argument about whether this or that leader has a doctrine is a really vexed one anyway. So some leaders will want to kind of set it out themselves. They want to give a speech and they want to say, this is my doctrine, this is how I understand these things. And to some extent, you could look at something like the Gujral doctrine. He doesn't quite put it like that himself, but very rapidly it gets framed in those terms. And it is kind of a clear intellectual framework for how to operate specifically in the South Asian region. But then other doctrines kind of get imposed on leaders if you like. So Manmohan Singh doesn't say, I have my own doctrine, but others come along and say there is a doctrine. So Sanjay Baru does. I think some other people sitting at the table have done as well in the past. So, but in Modi's case, quite early on, there were a whole number of kind of BJP-affiliated people who were saying, there is this doctrine. And there was then a debate, which is still ongoing, about whether or not there actually is a coherent doctrine that has, clear intellectual or ideological dimensions to it or framework to it that we can then link to specific policies. But in the Modi case, I would still stick to my guns on this one and say that whilst there are a whole series of different competing ideological positions, concepts, arguments and so on going on, I don't think they coalesce into anything like a kind of coherent doctrine.
Thanks. Dr. Chaudhary.
Thank you, Professor. Very good presentation. I was just wondering, though. I mean, this is more or less broadly a theoretical question. When entities which are already viewed as soft try to push the soft power thing. I mean, when Joseph and I talked about soft power, America was, of course, obviously a hard power. America had nuclear capabilities. Even if you speak of the Europeans, I mean, there was the Aryan Teutonic, the concept of Siegfried slaying the dragon, etc. I mean, they were hard. So today, when they propagate soft power, it complements what was already perceived as a hard entity in historical times. With India, the problem may be, that India has always been, India's great intellectual or whatever power was always soft power. I mean, you go back to Gandhi, or even during our times, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, we had some impact on the New Left movement, etc. So today, pushing the soft power bit would be accentuating the imbecilic political, position that you spoke of. So isn't there a contradiction there? Because you haven't done enough on the hard power, so you're pushing something that is not relevant.
I think that's a really interesting, really interesting kind of comment to make. I mean, I think there are signs that might be one significant line of critique of Modi's approach. So, particularly if we look at Bharat Karnad's book that recently came out on Staggering Forward, I think it's called, on Modi's foreign policy, he advances a version of that argument and wants to say that all of this discussion of India as a Vishwaguru, as its soft power and so on and so forth, that all of this is a distraction from the need to build hard power resources. And that is a kind of a reasonably self-sufficient and functioning economy on which you can build a decent defence industrial base on which you can build the kinds of weapons that you need to defend yourself in the world. And interestingly, to some degree, his argument chimes with mine that he wants to say there's been quite significant investment in this other area, all of this religious diplomacy, soft power, so on and so forth, and that's been a huge distraction from doing the hard work of becoming a hard power, which you need in order to realise your interests out there in the world. I've got some sympathy with that argument as well, but then it points back to my argument, which is, we've moved away from pragmatism towards a much more ideological foreign policy in this context. The ideology here, Rahul Sagar, give him his due and his credit for carefully reading through a whole series of Hindu nationalist texts. And what he identified rightly in people like Gowalkar is the argument that whilst Hindus for a period need to be strong, they need to be manly, they need to be all of those sorts of things, that eventually, when everybody realises the fundamental truth, then we won't need any of that anymore. We'll have an integrated, properly humanistic society, which these Hindu nationalist ideologues look towards. And in a way, I think you can see this kind of leap towards this religious diplomacy as kind of missing out the intervening stage of hardness.
Diego.
I have two questions. One is how unique is this emphasis on religious diplomacy? Can you name other prominent examples, even contemporary or from the past, that they put religious diplomacy at the center of the public diplomacy outreach? And the second is, you said that the two reinventions of Stewart and Coleridge didn't really reinvent foreign policy. Can you please convince me that liberalization didn't, really?
I suspect that I'll have to put that second part to one side, and we can have that argument, hopefully in print, at some point or another. In terms of the use of religious diplomacy, so if you look at most of the literature on religious diplomacy, because it's seen as being a phenomenon in international politics, the practitioners are principally religious leaders. So if we look at sort of faith-based diplomacy, religious diplomacy, most of the discussion is about, papal diplomacy, for example, or it might be about using papal good offices to facilitate other kinds of diplomatic acts. So the rapprochement between Cuba and the United States that was facilitated by the Holy See is an example of this kind of faith-based diplomacy, if you like. The idea being that, because the two parties respected the Vatican and took it seriously and respected the fact that it would keep its word, that gave it an edge in diplomatic circles and allowed it to engage. And in a way, I suppose you can see Modi is operating in the same kind of way. He's trying to sort of depoliticize himself and raise himself up as this kind of dialogic figure. This figure that can, transcend civilizations, transcend religions, that can facilitate this dialogue that needs to happen. We see this in the comments that he has when he opens the World Sufi Forum, for example. This is very clear. So he goes along, opens this thing in New Delhi, gives this big long speech in which he says, we need forums like this, and I'm helping and funding and supporting these things because these are the ways in which we're going to solve terrorism and political extremism and all the problems that exist within some fringes of Islam. So, and I'm making this contribution towards this kind of act. So there are other examples, but there are not that many examples of, in the modern period at least, of political leaders doing this as opposed to religious leaders.
Iqbal.
I'm curious if you see a dichotomy in the way Modi approaches or employs religion, particularly Hindu or Hindutva images as well, domestically and in terms of foreign policy. So internally, he would speak in terms of the strong Hindu, muscular Hindu, 56 inches chest, but outside it's a smiling face. And I'm always puzzled, not puzzled, but always interested in his use of Vivekananda, for instance. So domestically, it's about Vivekananda's idea of the muscular body, but internationally, it's about the nice face of Hinduism. So do you see a dichotomy there? And if I could just throw a little, just something you mentioned earlier. That speech at the Sufi conference was actually quite interesting in itself, because what he was, within that speech, you can actually see a good Muslim, bad Muslim rhetoric as well, which fits into his domestic politics itself.
No, I completely agree with you on that second point. There's no question that it's not a particularly subtle message. That question about the good Muslim, bad Muslim issue. The internal and external sides of things. See, I struggled with this for a very long period of time until I realised that I think both the internal and the external messaging here are aimed at the same audience. They're aimed at the domestic audience. So internally to certain kinds of audiences, yes, it's about strength, it's about manliness, and it's also about, other Vivekanandan ideals, social work. Social work in order to, and that quality that Modi has of, is almost, I know this is terrible to say, it's kind of this Gandhian campaigning that he seems to think that that's the best way of engaging in politics. So rather than institutional change, rather than kind of ongoing shifts in structures, instead it's a campaign after campaign, social mobilization. That's an RSS idea. It's a kind of a Gandhian idea as well. So but the messaging outside, when he's standing up in the UN or he's standing up in other forums and he's saying, we can. We've got all these wonderful things to give to the world and so on. Those parts of those speeches are not, I don't think, aimed at an external audience. Because in many cases, the external audience is simply not going to understand references to Vivekananda and the Vedas. right? There's not a sufficient understanding. And 3 Acharya yogis sent off, or 3 Acharya envoys sent off to embassies in the US are not going to remedy that problem of the lack of understanding. So they are, like all of these kinds of speeches, I think they're aimed partly at the domestic audience, where they play very well, I think. And so they're 2 sides of the same coin rather than being aimed at different things. I think that's how you resolve the question.
Anyone else? I think you really. Let me just step in. Maybe we'll extend the debate after that. I think the 3-4 issues come out of your presentation. One, there is the question of religion and India's society, India's state. It's been one of the more difficult, contentious issues from the beginning. That it was not just a divide between Hindutva and the non-Hindutva, or secularists versus non-secularists. You could also frame it as a Gandhi versus Nehru thing as well. That one was practicing it, with religious symbolism, of actually articulating concepts like Ram Raja, of prayer, of, yes, tolerance, on the other hand, coexistence of communities. But religion was not something separate from the rest of the structure. But Nehru, as the first Prime Minister, I think much more in a French Enlightenment style of separation of religion and state. In a religion theory, a comprehensive thing. And personally himself, never went to a temple, at home or abroad. So there was a different way of way he organized it. But I think in practice, it was never easy to really separate the two. What you can say is happening in India today is really the re-emergence of the religious into the public sphere in a manner that puts off most people who take in the Nehruvian canon as the only way of organizing Indian society. But I think it's an inflection point, and it is a moment that where it will lead us. We don't know at this stage, but I think it's important to note that we are really at a different plane. It's also linked to, I think, a fact that the people who are running the country today, I think these are not just BJP, RSS, but they're also people unlike us. It is unlike the old elite that was running in India, that a bunch of people who really come from a different cultural milieu or of a lower middle class, or that did not really take the idea of separation as absolutely real, and that they think about these things in a different manner. I think this part of the problem is there is a new elite that is pushing the old one, old Nehruvian type of an elite, and I think that you see daily in India that battle going on. But if you go back and look at it, it's one thing for Nehru at the national level, but if you went to the state level leaders, even in the 50s, 60s, they didn't abide by the Nehruvian framework. I think religion constantly intruded in the way they thought about it. While there was a general peaceful atmosphere, which today there is a problem with it, but so it has never been such a clean, neat argument that the national debate frames it today. But I think that's part of the story, and I think given the charged atmosphere at this point, separating this out, it's going to be quite complicated, and I don't even see an effort that's being made. But in terms of use of religion, I would say three levels at which you can think of. I think one is the conviction, which you talked about. And I think that conviction predates Modi coming into power. Actually, if you go to Gujarat, his tenure as chief minister, there is an international Buddhist conference, he calls it. He never did a Hindu conference, but he did an international Buddhist conference. I think it was, I don't remember the exact year, where he said, look, he had a dream and that he wanted to build this grand Buddhist vihara in Gujarat. And that Vadnagar, where his birthplace, was an ancient Buddhist site, and he got the Archaeological Survey of India to come and open up, and they found it. So therefore, at least the Buddhist thing was you could trace it some of to his previous statements. And it was a persistent element of his thinking. And of course, that has continued in different ways, but quite clearly that streak runs through, but I think that's not been fully documented. So I think it's important to see, and I think as far as the post, when he first meets Xi Jinping, he tells him that, look, I got this Vatnagar, this way Buddha happened, you guys, you must come over and see it. So, I mean, that brings you to the second element of instrumentalization of religion as a way of engaging other people. That quite clearly use of the Buddhist sentiment as a way of connecting to Southeast Asia has been pretty strong. And we've also seen an attempt, I mean, in Nepal quite clearly as the only Hindu state in the world, of a direct outreach to them. But we've also seen it in a more sophisticated ways that it is played out. For example, in Sri Lanka, where the UPA government and the previous governments identified themselves so completely with the Tamils and got marginalized from the Sinhalese. Modi used the Buddhist card as a way of saying, look, I'm with you too, that we are not just with the Tamils and we are not like the UPA government, which wouldn't even, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh wouldn't even go to a Commonwealth meeting. While here is saying, look, I'm connected to both of you, so therefore there is a different dimension I'm going to emphasize here, so therefore you have actually as a way of strengthening ties, where India was so completely out of the game in Sri Lanka, while the Buddhist thing gave him an interesting opening with the Sinhalese majority, and where it gives you a more balanced approach to the two sides in Sri Lanka. There is also the Islamic thing. I mean, besides the point Iqbal has raised, there's an interesting episode. King Abdullah of Jordan gets a very special treatment. He's driven straight from the airport to a conference of the Muslim clerics talking about moderation. I don't know if it was a sell about King Abdullah being a descendant of the great Prophet himself, and that actually you are suggesting that, look, and that standing up with him and talking about the moderation, that, look, we need to, but again, it's interesting. So I think it's not completely that there is the Islamic element to the bits and pieces where we've seen instrumentalization. But on the Christian side, I think you made an important point. I think he doesn't visit the Christian churches, but I think there you can see the tradition of deep conflict with the Christianity and especially the conversion issue. And I think Vajpayee faced the same problem. And, that time the Pope wanted to come. Vajpayee being Vajpayee, I think was more, he let him come in, but the argument about conversion, what do the missionaries do? So that is one of the sore points with the BJP, and I think that RSS, that continues as a serious issue. But I think what's interesting is the danger of blurring the traditional distinction, that you keep religion separate from diplomacy, that you do culture but you don't do religion, which is what the Indian state was. I mean, there was the Indian Council of Cultural Relations that Nehru did, and Dalai Lama, and India celebrated the 2,500th anniversary of Buddha in 1956-57 with great style, and Nehru actually used the Buddhist connection in different ways. I mean, you sent out the relics of Buddha wherever you could. So it's not that he was averse to, but it was framed as a cultural diplomacy, as opposed to more direct references to religion under Modi. I think that we've seen happen. So we not sure at this point. I mean, this is the new normal, or is it an exception, or how the next government might deal with it. The second set of issues, I mean, I won't attach too much importance to how many guys were in public diplomacy division.
No, I know. But
yeah, so I think a lot of it is just bureaucratic. I mean, random bureaucratic events. Most of the time, it has got mundane things to do with money and budget, rather than a grand design in which you're going to do non-governmental and not governmental. So a lot of that is, I wouldn't put too much weight onto that. But what is interesting is that there is actually a lot more role of the privates, of the foundations of the BJP, RSS that are doing this in a big way. But what's interesting question is it the end of Indian exceptionalism? Is it only India that's going this direction? But if you look at Pakistan or our neighboring countries, because it's never an issue. I mean, I think it's very much part of it. As I said, when Hasina comes to Delhi, she goes to Ajmer Dargah to pray, and every Pakistani leader, I think if there's a chance, he would like to go to Ajmer and do it. So is India, kind of defined an exceptional way of doing it? I mean, in the US, for example, the evangelical influence on the Trump administration, the Jerusalem decision was entirely as a sop to the evangelicals, and what Mike Pence is a leading representative of the evangelicals in the administration. So, barring Northern Europe, a religious, or a fully secularized society where religion does not figure, in most other places. Now you see in Poland today, in Hungary, and even in Europe today, where you're beginning to see some return of religion into the public sphere. So I don't know if it's good or bad. I mean, or other day I saw a picture of two Orthodox Russian clerics, I don't know, priests, kind of sanctifying S-400 missiles.
Yes, that's right.
So there you are. I mean, Russia, the old communist Russia, maybe which still these kind of things do happen. So I think, but this is going to be. I would only add that this is going to be an interesting field of inquiry. I think, in some senses, India becomes probably an interesting exhibit in the discourse on what role does religion have in promoting diplomacy. And finally, I mean, I would say, is there a doctrine? Because the doctrine is a very American construct, because every president is supposed to have his own doctrine, and then that kind of has framed discussion of foreign policies everywhere. But I would think if there is a core idea that exists in all these things, I mean, you mentioned it, that transcending the argument about non-alignment, strategic autonomy, that you no longer abide by that. And I think I can explain to you why there was that word got back in Shangri-La speech.
Oh, good.
It depends on which bureaucrats do it. But I think if you want to see Israel, I mean, there was a long interview, there's no text to it, wherein when he was launching the YouGov site, this was 2015, quite early on, where he talks about, look, everyone is engaging everyone else. So we are not into this, I'm going to stay neutral or non-aligned or autonomous. This is about power, this is about we must engage everyone without any inhibition. And a couple of times he said also that, look, I'm a Gujarati. Sorry for the ethnic stuff here, but I'm Gujarati, deal making is in my blood. So an openness to be pragmatic and discarding the burdens of anti-Westernism. So that again is a curiosity. I mean, I think a deeply religious Hindu is the least Western and least anti-Western compared to the RSS, compared to the BJP's own tradition, that here's a guy who's actually taken India declaring publicly, we've shed our historic hesitations about engaging the West, we are out there dealing with the West in a manner that it was considered impossible 5 years ago. So it is that transition, I think, away from the hand-wringing, the fear of being seen with the West, I would think would go down as probably the biggest contribution, which will last. And I think if it is a doctrine you want to frame it, it has to be around that notion that we have killed strategic autonomy, probably not fully buried, but there it is. And I think it's also founded on a change in India's own position, that India is now, as the third largest economy in PPP terms, or the sixth if you go by exchange rate today. So what is it separating itself from? What is it that's preventing the rest of the world from impinging on it? Which was the case for a weak state of $100 per capita in 1947 to one which actually has the capacity to influence the world around it. So the discourse itself, 2.0, 1.0, none of that really fits in with India's new location in the international system. And I think Modi, in his own non-academic, the guy who doesn't read briefs, I mean, wants only 3 slides is the maximum limit. Someone who's instinctively figured that India is a different beast today and that it can do this differently. So I would think if you want to ever frame a doctrine, it has to be around it. Sorry, I've taken quite long, but if there are no other questions, then maybe you could say something, then we can wrap it up. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Just to add on, with regard to Pakistan playing the Sikh religion card by Modi's government, the corridor to the Sikh pilgrimage centers, I think that will be an interesting aspect of Modi's diplomacy going forward, where he probably would mix religion with diplomacy or politics, to be more precise, with reference to Pakistan. Of course, it's too early to say how it will play out. It depends very much on what Pakistan would be doing in response to India's pleas. I wouldn't use the word plea, India's insistence that there should be a corridor for the Sikh pilgrims. I think that should also be factored in going forward, in my opinion.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, that's something that's just emerging, obviously. And there are obviously precedents to that, to having kind of pilgrimage routes opened or particular pathways and so on. So, but at the same time, it'll be interesting to watch whether or not this is part of some broader kind of initiative when it gets widened out in some sense, or whether there's an attempt to kind of create parallel corridors for other kinds of contexts. But I mean, in terms of the other comments that we've made, I mean, that's all obviously enormously helpful as always, and I'm very, very grateful to all of that, and I'm grateful too for all the questions and comments that others have made. So thank you very much indeed.
So if there's nothing else, please join me in thanking Ian for
Thank you.
his stimulating.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there some tea outside? Yeah, coffee.
Thank you. That's all hugely helpful. Really, really grateful.